You may ask how my mom knew some of those details.
This is local author Tammy Borden. She's speaking at EAA earlier today, telling a remarkable story. Jeff Alexander featured Tammy in small towns when she wrote a book about the stories her mother Waltraud shared about growing up in Germany during World War II. Now, one of those stories was about seeing an American pilot fall to his death after shooting down a German fighter plane. No one knew who that pilot was until Tammy started investigating. What she found is changing her life and the lives of the family of that downed pilot. And we're joined now by Tammy Borden, an author and someone you may recognize from, as we mentioned, Jeff Alexander's Small Towns. And in that story in Small Towns, you talked about the book that you wrote from your mother's story. So I'm curious why this particular story grabbed hold of you so much that you needed to investigate it and research to the extent that you have.
Yeah, something got under me that I just wanted to capture this story, and I wanted to find out who the pilot was that my mom saw go down. I just had some prodding in my soul that said, you need to find that man. You need to find out who he is and find his family.
Yeah.
And I can't explain why.
So it was pretty obvious from the story that Jeff did in your book that your mother's recollections were extremely vivid.
Yes.
Would you have been able to do this without her amazing memory powers, if you will?
No, my mom had an incredibly vivid memory, almost photographic. She remembered names and details, and I just recall that her telling this story, she really just brought it to life for me.
Well, you put with all your research, put a name to go along with this face and a story to go along with, you know, the end of his life.
Yeah.
How on earth did you research it to go from, because your mother didn't know the name,
No.
all she saw was a man falling from the sky.
Yes. What helped is that my mother grew up in a tiny, tiny village called Ampleben, Germany. It's about 25 kilometers from Brunswick. And I thought, well, how many American pilots would have gone down next to this tiny, tiny village? And so I went to military archives, the U.S. military archives, and there's extensive documentation on their website where you can go and
you can find a location.
I did a search for that, the name of that town, and so I searched for Ampleben, and one name popped up, and I looked, and sure enough, it was one man. And then I found additional records. I found his name, James Asbury Scarborough, and I found a photo of him, and I found his military war cemetery where he was relocated, because my mother told me that he was buried nearby, and that then after the war they dug him up and they sent him back. Which
was common.
Yes.
If they could find them, they often brought them home.
And so right in the report it said he was released to the mayor to be buried in the cemetery, just as my mother said. And it gave coordinates, like longitude, latitude, of where it happened, just as my mother said, just south of town. It was all there.
You mentioned your mother's almost photographic, and you may have found a report from his squadron of what took place that day. How close did those match from what the official record was to what your mother's recollection of seeing it was?
The official record did not note that James Scarborough had gotten in an aerial dogfight with an Me-109 Messerschmitt Nazi
That's a
plane.
German fighter plane. Yeah.
Yes. And what my mother saw is that the American pilot shot down that enemy plane.
Right.
And that enemy plane barreled nose first into the ground and was almost disintegrated. It was going so fast. And my mother saw then the American pilot bail from his plane, which had apparently also been shot.
Yeah.
He opened his parachute, but unfortunately he was too close to the ground, and my mom saw him plunge to his death.
The second part of this story is what's taken place in present day. You found his family, and his niece, as you told me, is the one in his family that really was attracted to this story, much like you.
Yes.
So you two connected recently.
Yes. Catherine, she is from Mississippi. So James was originally from Dublin, Georgia. And so she ended up in Mississippi, and she drove up all the way from Mississippi to meet me last weekend. And she brought the trunk full of she calls him Uncle Jimmy.
Okay.
Full of Uncle Jimmy's belongings. Everything is in there, from his baby book to his Boy Scout pin to his report cards to his uniform, his insignia, his hat. I mean, everything is in there. The flag that his mother was presented for funeral memorial honors, and his Purple Heart. Everything is in that trunk. The telegram that announced his death to his mother, and I just wept because I was like, his mother wept over this. They didn't know, they had no idea that he had gotten into a fight, and they had no idea that he shot down an enemy plane.
Did she express, and I would imagine it'd be very hard to express this, but what the information that you found meant to his family?
She said that it brought such closure to their family because their family had wondered for 80 years what happened to him. All they knew was that he was missing in action and then eventually declared dead. It was his first mission and his last. And he enlisted into the military because of a passion and a desire to make a difference, and to think that he was on his first mission and he never accomplished anything, to know that he actually shot down an enemy plane gave purpose to it.
I know this is a small part in the book about your mom. This is one of the stories that you shared, but were alarms going off in your head? Is there a bigger story here maybe for you with this and what you learned from the family?
I think there is a bigger story. The first story is to tell your story. Whenever I get to speak about the book or in front of a crowd, I always encourage people, please tell your story. There are people with haunting pasts, just like my mom, who are afraid to bring up the pain of the past, thinking that it's going to be too much. And the reality is that if you don't deal with your past, it's still your present, and it controls every part of your life. And the second part of that is you have no idea the healing that your story can bring to another family, to someone else. It might not even be in your lifetime. It might be 80 years later. I want the world to know my mom.
Yeah.
And now I want the world to know Jimmy too. I feel like my mom's story is just beginning, even though she's been gone 4 years now. And I feel like Jimmy's story is just beginning, even though he's been gone 80 years.
Are you the one to tell it?
I think I am.
Tammy, thanks so much.
Sure.